Hello everyone. So what I've done here is a revision video for you on metaethics. A few of you requested this. I'm going to run through it all nice and quickly. I've only done the basics here. So obviously this is not going to be everything you need, but hopefully if you're not quite sure where to start with this topic, this will be helpful. With metaethics, don't worry too much about getting loads and loads and loads of detail, because I'll show you some questions at the end of this. The questions that they tend to set for this topic are actually quite nice. So as long as you're happy with the main terminology and particularly the strengths and weaknesses, you should be fine. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just go through the difference between normative ethics and metaethics. So normative ethics is kind of what you'll have done up to now. It's certainly what you did last year. So pretty much all ethical theories, like your natural moral law, your situation ethics, your virtue ethics, they're normative because they establish moral norms. That's how they get their name. They tell people what to do. Now, the ones that we've done in the metaethics topic, divine command theory, utilitarianism, and intuitionism, they're also normative ethical theories because in their own way, they tell people what to do. So it's not that they're not normative, but in this topic, we're looking at them in a different way. We're looking at them in a meta-ethical context. So it's not so much about how do they tell people what to do. It's more how do they view the concepts of right and wrong. That's the main difference. Yeah, so meta-ethics, meta comes from a Greek word and it means beyond. So we're looking beyond ethics, kind of behind just what does it say. We're looking at what do the concepts of right and wrong even mean. So in normative ethics, so in something like situation ethics, it's kind of assumed that you already know what right and wrong is. If you're using situation ethics, it assumes that you've bought into the concept of rightness being the same as agape love. But metaethics looks at how we arrive at that kind of conclusion. So how do we measure or understand the concept of right and wrong? What does the word good even mean? That sort of thing. That's what metaethics is all about. Excuse me, coughing and spluttering. I've got a cold today. So, two major terms that you need to know for metaethics. Metaethical theories essentially come in two groups. You've got ethical naturalism and ethical non-naturalism. So naturalism, you'll have come across this in religion and science as well. If something's naturalistic, it means it's kind of grounded in the world around us. It's objective. We can discover it through our own life experience. So ethical naturalism says that goodness and badness are grounded in things we can understand, and they're grounded in the world around us. So we can figure out what they are. So, for example, Bentham's utilitarianism says that goodness and badness are grounded in the concepts of pleasure and pain. That's how we know what good and bad is. They equate to pleasure and pain, and we can all understand what pleasure and pain are because they're experiences we have in our lives. That's why utilitarianism is an example of ethical naturalism. Ethical non-naturalism, so this is going to be divine command theory and also intuitionism, says that goodness and badness are still real, but because they don't kind of come from our world, they're not grounded in our world, they come from somewhere else. So if you take divine command theory, for instance, goodness and badness come directly from God. So that's never going to be something that we can figure out for ourselves. We have to be told it. And Moore's intuitionism says that goodness and badness aren't concepts that can be broken down, analysed, measured, understood in terms of other things. They're kind of simple concepts and we know them when we see them. So I'll say more about that when we get to Moore. Right, so let's start with divine command theory. Now, from a meta-ethical point of view, divine command theory is non-naturalist. So it's not grounded in the world around us. Rightness and wrongness are decided by the will of God, and there's no other way for us to know what they are. So divine command theory is dead simple. Right is what God commands, wrong is what God forbids. So if God tells you to do it, it's a good thing. If God tells you not to do it, it's a bad thing. And so it's only through knowing the will of God that people can know what is right and wrong. You can't figure it out for yourself. So there are some strengths of divine command theory. So if you're a Christian and you believe that God literally, genuinely exists, this could be quite persuasive, particularly if you believe God is good, which Christians do believe. A good God must command good things, so therefore it's obvious that you should do those things and that those are the good things to do. So this is quite persuasive often to certain groups of Protestants who live by sola scriptura. So God's commands can be known through scripture. It's right there in the Bible. There's no excuse for getting it wrong. Also, the simplicity is kind of a strength of divine command theory. God's commands are universal. They don't change over time. There's an end goal, so we know why we're being good. It's because people want to go to heaven. And also, if God is God, he's a perfectly fair judge. So it's not possible for God to get it wrong. God is totally fair. Unsurprisingly, there are some weaknesses as well. You know enough about the Bible now to know that there is huge disagreement over how far the text can be trusted. So even if God's will is there in the Bible, even if God's command is there, how can we be sure what it is? Because the text is so unreliable. It was written down by humans. It may have been changed over time. There are translation issues, all the things that we come across when we look at the Bible and we can't be sure what it says. So to say that it's the sole source of rightness and wrongness could be argued to be very dodgy. I'm sure you will have come up with this by yourself, but the Bible contains commands that we may strongly feel to be immoral. So are we supposed to just accept what the Bible says in Leviticus about homosexuality being punishable by death? Are we supposed to accept all the stuff about slavery? Are we supposed to accept all the misogynistic stuff? If it feels to us that that is wrong, then divine command theory is saying it's right. There's a real problem there. Another weakness is it doesn't seem to allow genuine moral choice. If we're only being good to get into heaven, or perhaps to avoid going to hell, is this really morality? Is that a free moral choice? And then, probably the biggest weakness, a little bit of genius called the Euthyphro dilemma. Is conduct right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's right? Now, if the first one is true, is conduct right because God commands it, then that suggests that there's a problem with God's omnipotence. And the other way, does God command it because it is right? That suggests that morality is independent of God. So there's a problem with God's omniscience. Either way, God is undermined. So it's quite a strong argument, that one. Okay, moving on to utilitarianism. So meta-ethically, it's a naturalist ethical theory. So it's not like divine command theory. Divine command theory is non-naturalist. This is naturalist. This is because utilitarianism says there are moral facts about the world that are grounded in our own experience. So if you Bentham, this is all about pleasure and pain. So pleasure equals goodness, pain equals badness. And we know this because we understand those things, we can experience them. Once we know what moral goodness is, so once we understand that goodness equals pleasure, we can develop rules and guidelines to tell people what to do. So this is how Bentham arrives at the principle of utility. If moral goodness is pleasure, then we want to be working to bring about the most pleasure. So that's how we get to do what brings about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, depending on whether you're Bentham or you're Mill, you are going to have a slightly different definition of good. So for Bentham, it's all about pleasure. For Mill, it's more about happiness, and it's a little bit more subtle. Okay, so there's some strengths. Factual basis for morality, everyone can understand. Everyone knows what pleasure is. Everyone knows what pain is. From that, we can come up with a system that's easy to follow. so the principle of utility and Bentham's hedonic calculus. I don't think you can be asked about the hedonic calculus in metaethics, but when you come on to do Bentham and Kant, the hedonic calculus is quite a big part of Bentham's thinking, so it's worth knowing that. It gives us a way of holding people to account, measuring the moral goodness of people. If someone's bringing about a lot of happiness, they're a good person. If they're not a good person. Also, if you ask most people what they want out of life, they'll say they want to be happy. So it seems reasonable to suggest that that's what morality is all about. And another strength of utilitarianism is we kind of see it everywhere. So democracy is based on utilitarian principles, and so are most legal systems. It may not be perfect, but it works pretty well. Now, weaknesses, happiness and pleasure. How do I know that what gives me happiness gives you happiness? These are hard things to define. Also, if people get pleasure from causing pain to others, is that really morally good? The principle of utility is all about doing the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, what if you're not in that greatest number? What if you're in the minority? You're going to lose out again and again and again. Because it's consequentialist, you have to guess at the consequences of your actions. We also have this problem with situation ethics. How do you know going in that your action is going to be agapeic? How do you know that your action is going to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number? And then this is where it gets a little bit technical. Because it's a naturalist theory, you can argue that it commits the naturalistic fallacy. This is where you move illogically from saying that something is the case to saying, therefore, that something ought to be the case. So I've got a little bit more on this for you. So this was something picked up by G.E. Moore, who is actually your main man for Intuitionism, but he criticised all ethical naturalist theories. He said they commit the naturalistic fallacy. So we can play it out like this. So you can state a fact, like she is old and lonely, talking about like an elderly neighbour, or your grandma or something. And you could use that to move to the moral value and say, because she is old and lonely, therefore you ought to visit her. The problem with that is we could do the exact same thing this way. Start with the fact she is old and lonely, therefore you ought to euthanize her. That becomes a moral value. Two wildly different outcomes there. That was not acceptable to Moore, largely because if you think about it, you could use utilitarianism to argue for both those outcomes, which are completely different from each other. So Moore thought, well, they can't both be right. That suggests there's a real problem with the logic there. So a little bit more on Intuitionism. Again, rejecting ethical naturalism. This is a non-naturalist theory. So Moore thought that this would avoid the problem of the naturalistic fallacy. And he also just took a different view about what rightness and wrongness were. He argued that they were real, but that ultimately they were simple concepts. He argued that good can't be defined in terms of other things. Good is simply good. So he said it's a bit like yellow. If somebody asks you what is yellow, you can't then kind of break down the concept of yellow any further, but you know it when you see it. He thinks good is like that. And we know this through moral intuition. So just kind of strong, intuitive feelings that tell us what's right and wrong. This is what Moore means when he says certain moral values are self-evident. So at a certain point, you just know. It's just obvious what's right and wrong. So the trolley problem is a good way of looking at this. Trolley problem, you remember, you're driving a trolley, there's one person on one track, 5 people on the track you're heading down. If you pull the lever and move the points, the trolley will hit the one person. If you do nothing, it will hit the 5 people. So Bentham would argue that you should move the points. That's the greatest good for the greatest number, because that way the 5 people will survive. But an intuitionist would probably feel that they couldn't bring themselves to do that, because it would be wrong to do an action that would kill an innocent person. So the intuitionist would probably do nothing, because they would just feel that by doing that action and taking that moral responsibility, they'd be doing something wrong. Now, there's no real solution to the trolley problem. You might have a view on what the right thing is to do, but all of the views have their problems. So, some strengths of intuitionism. Everyone has them. Everyone has strong moral feelings, so it's quite hard to just deny it straight away. It does solve the problem of the naturalistic fallacy. It accepts that our moral intuitions aren't perfect, so it's realistic. It knows that we're sometimes in difficult situations like the trolley problem. We're not always going to get it right. And it gets rid of the problem we have in ethical naturalism, which is where we argue over what good means, because you don't define it in terms of other things. You just know it when you see it. A few weaknesses, though. It doesn't explain where these moral intuitions come from. It just says we have them. It shuts down moral debate. If you're trying to talk to somebody about an issue like abortion and they say, well, I just know that abortion is wrong, that's kind of the end of the debate. There's no real room to unpack that or to move on your thinking. So that's a bit of a problem. How do we know that our intuitions are what we think they are? How do we know they're not just influenced by the society at the time? So, for instance, if we were alive in the 18th century, might we intuitively feel that slavery was good and that women are inferior to men? Can't we argue that our intuitions are just due to our social conditioning, in which case they're not intuitions at all? And also, you can solve the problem of the naturalistic fallacy because you put in the idea of human flourishing. So with the old lady example, if you say she is old and lonely, visiting her will contribute to our human flourishing, therefore you ought to visit her, you've solved the problem. Because if you put in human flourishing and then argue for euthanasia, that doesn't work because killing people doesn't lead to human flourishing. So it's not that hard to get rid of that problem. Okay, last little bit. I just want to have a look at some questions that you could get on metaethics. So I've put a couple of 10 markers there. It could be something like examine the key features of ethical naturalism. You could talk about any ethical naturalist theory there, but you would need to talk about why it was naturalist. So what I wouldn't do is just talk about utilitarianism without saying how it is an ethically naturalist theory. And then you could get a strengths or weaknesses question. So it could be examine the strengths of divine command theory, the weaknesses. You could get intuitionism for that. You could get utilitarianism for that. And then a 15-mark question. This first one actually did come up one year. So you won't get this exact one, but it's worth having a go at it. Metaethics shows that moral values are facts. So just to decode that, that's talking about, are moral values grounded in real things or are they coming from somewhere else? So it's naturalism versus non-naturalism. And then moral values are self-evident. That's about intuitionism. So that's about whether intuitionism works. So as you can see, not horrible questions, but they will need a little bit of planning and a little bit of thinking. Like I said, this topic only scratches the surface of metaethics. It doesn't go that deep. So don't panic. A lot of people feel like this is the hardest topic, but it isn't really. As long as you've got these basics, you should be all right. Okay, so that's the end of that. If you've got any questions, just get in touch with one of us and we will help you out. We'll also be happy to take a look at any practice essays that you want to write. Okay, see you soon.